Okay, we're ready to get started. Let's go ahead and, let's see, two verses I want us to look at. Let's go ahead and start in Matthew 22 and verse 30. We're going to continue our discussion of angels. And maybe you remember last week, 7 days ago. That's a long ways back. Ooh. Don't even remember what I preached on, and that was 10 minutes ago. What does the word angel mean? In the Hebrew, it's malak, M-A-L-A-K, as you transliterate it. Really, M-L-K. They didn't have as many vowels like we do. And in the Greek, it's angelos, so it is more or less just transformed into what we have today. What's it literally mean? You remember? A messenger. Great. It's a messenger, primarily a messenger from God to man, most usually. And a regular person sometimes is spoken of as an angelos or a malak, as far as being a messenger. But what we're talking about in our class are the heavenly beings who come down. All right, another thing we talked about is, when were angels created? Or were they created? Were they eternal? Have angels always been around? Are they like mini gods or demigods? I guess is the correct way you say that. No, they're not demigods. They're not eternal. They were created. But they're created before the beginning of the world. All right? And we talked about how they're different than us. They have a different way of living, different plan of salvation, of course. They're free moral beings. They can sin and they can be judged. We talked about that a little bit last week. And we kind of hit a hiccup, and we spent a while, and it's one of those things where the bell rings at the most inopportune times. So I kind of want to cover that and kind of back up a little bit and make sure we've covered that pretty well and covered a little bit more. Because what I want us to spend some time on is talking about angels getting married, okay? Matthew 22:30, what does that verse say? Anybody remember? This is where the Sadducees came and they approached Jesus. If Matthew 22:30 is still where Matthew 20:30 is supposed to be. Okay? Remember the Sadducees? And why? What was the difference between Sadducees and Pharisees? Which ones believed in the afterlife? The Pharisees. The way you remember that is the Sadducees believed that when you died, it was all over. That's why they were sad, you see. Okay? That's why they're sad, you see. They didn't believe in the afterlife. They were under a lot of Greek influence. And so there you had the Sadducees. Now, the Sadducees come up to Jesus with a question. There's a fella who gets, or a lady who gets married. The husband dies, so she gets married, and the husband dies. She gets married, and the husband dies. She gets married, the husband dies. She gets married, the husband dies. She gets married, husband dies. She gets married, the husband dies. She gets married, the husband dies. They get to heaven. Who's this lady married to? I don't know, but I'm not sure what number 7 was thinking, right? Number 7 should have said, let's just go out, don't bother about cooking. That's a joke. But anyway, by the time number 7 comes across, and probably this is what the Sadducees always said to the Pharisees, trying to prove heaven doesn't exist. They probably would bring up this story, and the Pharisees would say, I don't know, maybe the first, maybe the last. We really don't know. But Jesus says, no, wait a second. Realize heaven is a different sphere than what we're talking about. And that's where we get to the verse which we're looking at, Matthew 22:30. You see, in heaven we'll be like the angels. Now notice it doesn't say we will be angels. Your loved ones who have passed on, they don't grow wings and hang out on clouds. They don't turn into angels, okay? They're in heaven, but they're a different kind of being. But we see that we will be like the angels, that we neither marry nor are we given in marriage. So when we get to heaven, our relationship will be different. I think the scriptures prove pretty convincingly, at least to me, that we'll know one another in heaven, but our relationships will be very different than they are here on earth. So we'll know those who we've known before, but we're not going to be married. We're not going to be parents and children and all of those sort of things. We may know of those relationships that existed in the past, but there's not marriage. Okay, now why does that matter to us? Because of what we see over in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 2. And that's what I want us to spend some time on. Go ahead and run over Genesis 6:2. Now, Genesis is a beautiful book of the Old Testament. In fact, it's one of my favorite books because so much is covered. But when you run across Genesis, realize that every word in this book is treasure. It's prime real estate. Now, every verse of the Bible is prime real estate. It's all inspired by God. But Genesis covers, how much time do you think Genesis covers? Joseph is in Egypt, somewhere around 1800 to 2200 BC, somewhere in that area. Okay? So pull that back. If the earth, and I think most people reasonably say the earth will be around 6,000 years old, that says Genesis covers about 2,500 years. Okay? So you cover 50 chapters in 2,500 years, that is precious real estate. And Moses, as he's writing through the book of Genesis, he is flying along. And so he doesn't take a lot of time to cover things which don't matter. Now, Lord willing, someday we will have the blessing to study Genesis because I love going through it. But recognize he's telling the story this whole time. A lot of these turns, for whatever reason, every once in a while we'll have a turn or something, and it'll seem like, why did he throw that in there? Why does that matter? There's a reason. There's a reason it's put in there because it matters to the overall story in which he's telling us. Okay? Genesis is very, very inspired. All right. Now, the reason I say that is because we got to read context. Now, let's go ahead and run over here, chapter 6. Let's begin in verse 1. Okay? And it came to pass, daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that all whom they chose. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, for indeed he is indeed flesh. Yet his sons of God came into the daughters of men, they bore children to them. Okay, verse 5 speaks about wickedness. Now, a lot of times, we'll read those 4 verses, and we won't pay attention to what came before, and we won't pay attention to what comes after. And when you don't pay attention to what comes before or what comes after, it looks like these are angels. Okay? And the reason you think these are angels is that word for sons of God that are listed there. Many times in the book of Job, sons of God refers to the angels. So what we'll say is, hey, look at this. The angels came down, and as the angels came down, they came to this earth and everything. I get him before he gets up here to get me. All right. He started this morning in the foyer, and he got to that row. I like them coming forward, but not if they're a bug. All right. So what you had here was angels marrying women and making great big giants which are walking around. And a lot of people read that passage and say, well, that's absolutely what it's talking about. But what do you have to do with Genesis? Read context, right? Read context. So let's check out some of this context that we're having fun with here. Okay? Genesis 1 and 2, we make the world, right? Now, Genesis 3, what happens? A serpent shows up, and the serpent is whom? Satan, okay? Satan says, hey, eat the fruit of this tree. And Eve says, I'm not supposed to eat the fruit of this tree. And Satan says, more or less, God never wants you to have any fun. You got to have some fun. And Eve says, hey, I got to have some fun. She eats of the fruit, gives it to her husband. Now death is entered. And then we go through all this. Hey, this woman you gave to me. No, it's not the woman you gave to me, it's Satan, and all this other stuff. And then we receive the curse, which is there as you go through. The sorrow that will come through childbirth, the sorrow that comes to man because of the great work which is here. My wife was telling me the other day, we had studied this passage, and she said she thought the curse of woman wasn't so much the conception and the pain of childbirth. She thought the curse came before when God made clothes, because she was tired of laundry. And she said, until they sinned, they didn't have to wear clothes, so Eve didn't have to do laundry until that happened. I don't know about that, but that was her view that she had. All right, now we're getting a little bit closer. Run into chapter 4. Chapter 4, we've got 2 boys, okay? Probably many others born, but 2 boys right now. What are their names? Cain and Abel, okay? They both offer a sacrifice unto God. As they offer the sacrifice, one is permitted, one is acceptable, one is not. God lets Cain know his sacrifice is not acceptable. It was not of the first fruit, it was not according to God's plan, and therefore he was condemned. Now, Cain loses his temper. And it's interesting, God actually goes to Cain and says, listen, you're angry. You need to take care of yourself because this anger is going to cause great problems. Cain did not take care of himself. And so he found Abel, and what did he do? He killed him. He slew him, buried him, so nobody could find him. Well, the blood cried forth, right? And we see that even in the New Testament, that even Abel, even though he's dead, yet he still speaks by his righteous life. And so Cain is condemned and sent out, and he is going to be a vagabond. He's going to be somebody who cannot work the earth, going to have to be somebody who finds another way to live. And so he goes, and it's interesting. You go to chapter 4, verse 17. After he lives in the land of Nod, they begin bearing children. Enoch, what does Enoch do in verse 17? Close enough. That's a little bit later. That's a little bit later. Chapter 4 and verse 17. Enoch builds a city, and he builds a city which is here. All right? So we have city dwellers coming here. And then you have in verse 19, polygamy, which begins happening. You have Lamech takes on 2 wives. As you go on a little bit further, you see that they're innovators. They learn how to do tents and livestock in verse 20. In verse 21, they learn musical instruments. In verse 22, they're able to handle bronze and iron. And then you see the abusiveness of these people in verse 23, that they're very able to know war and be able to go across and fight different people. Okay? Now you get to chapter 5, and you see the other line. The other line, not Cain, the other line is Seth. Now, Seth, you'll go through that genealogy, okay? You'll notice each one of these people are very simple, very plain folks. You know, they tend to their sheep, they stay out in the wilderness, they care for one another, they live for a while, and they teach their child the knowledge of God, which is here. And so as you go through, you run through this genealogy, you get to a fellow named Methuselah in verse 25 of chapter 5. And how long did Methuselah live? Whoops, a little bit later, isn't it? Verse 27. How long did Methuselah live? 969 years. I hope that boy didn't play football in high school and get a messed up knee. Wouldn't that be a long time to have to deal? You know, they tell us that when folks get in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, they start getting a little bit sore, right? Think how sore you'd be if you're 969 years old. Well, obviously, life is different back then. And so it's interesting how the human body has changed over the ages, isn't it? Now, what's interesting about Methuselah living 969 years? What happened the year of the flood? That's the same year that Methuselah died. Kind of interesting to think about that. All right. That is the first 5 chapters. Now, the reason I'm wanting us to see that is we're coming up with how many main lines? You have the line of Cain and the line of Seth, right? Cain's line tend to be a religious line. They seem to be religious people. No. They are killing one another. They're really big in polygamy. They're really big on trying to better up everybody. And then you have, besides Cain's line, who? Seth. You got Seth on the other side, okay? Now you continue chapter 6. Let's keep it in context. Keep going along, and notice there in verse 8. Noah found what? Favor. Favor, grace. That Greek word charis, which is what we translate grace. He found favor and grace. Now, a lot of people teach us that grace is not found in the Old Testament. Is grace ever found in the Old Testament? Absolutely. Abraham lied many times because he was afraid because his wife is so pretty. Did God give him grace? Sure. Did David ever get grace? Absolutely. Did Israel ever get grace? Sure. There's grace all through this in the Old Testament. Hasn't read this verse, chapter 6 of Genesis, and hadn't read much of the rest of the Old Testament either. So you see where the world became evil, and therefore God put a stop to it, and then we have a restart. All right? Now what I'm wanting us to do is notice context. Context. You got 2 lines, cut up chapter 6, then you have the evil, and then you... Okay? Now in light of that, as you go down all the way to Noah, we've introduced Noah in verse 32 of chapter 5. Now it came to pass, men continued, men, they were beautiful, they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. What's making them pick these women? Is it the goodness and the faithfulness? Okay, outward appearance. Now, I'm not teaching you should marry somebody ugly. That's not what God teaches at all. But who are some people that ran into trouble because they looked only at someone's beauty in order to find a mate? Samson, I have found this woman among the Philistines. And Manoah and his wife, Samson's parents, said, wait a second. You've got a whole country. Can't you not find a single Jew, an Israelite, who's pretty? And he said, I don't care. I want her. Okay, did that turn out well for Samson? No. Okay, who else? David saw Bathsheba upon the rooftop bathing, and he decided he wanted to have her. Okay, he ended up murdering one of his best friends. He ended up lying. He ended up destroying his family because he chose somebody over beauty rather than over reason. Okay, anybody else? Solomon. Solomon chose many people, sometimes politically, sometimes because of beauty, and it pierced him through many, many, many times. Okay. Statistically, what happens in the Lord's church when a Christian marries a non-Christian? Statistically. Not always. We got a lot of faithful ladies who are married to non-Christians. But statistically, what happens? Leave the church. Do you know what percentage? A little bit more than that. It's close to 80%. Close to 80%. Now, I'll share that someday in a bulletin article. One of these days when I get to writing all my bulletin articles I want to write. Between the church in Carnes, Tennessee, which did a study of it, the church in Edmond, Oklahoma, which did a study in it, and a study which was done in Austin, Texas, over a period of 25 years, 80%, 4 out of 5 people will leave the church when they marry a non-Christian. Why? Okay. Yeah. A lot of times that's true. I've been studying with a family, and they say they want to come to church. They really want to come to church, and I think they really do. But they've got a 4-year-old, and you get up on Sunday morning, you've never been to church before. It's just hard to get that 4-year-old dressed. I think they're sincere, but week after week after week, it just doesn't happen. It is hard to break habits, and it's hard to break habits upward. They're easier to break downward than they are upward. It's a difficult thing to do. And one of the greatest determining factors of your eternal salvation is who you marry and who you're with. All right, that's the lesson being taught here, I think. Now, let's go back and figure out, what in the world all these words mean? The sons of God, daughters of men. Sons of God would be which line? Seth and Cain. You see this intermarriage? And because of that, trouble comes. Now the question is, where did these giants come from? Giants are men of renown, famous people, people who were well known and people who were very popular. All right. I think that fits the context a whole lot better. That doesn't run into your contradiction with Matthew 22:30, and that is seemingly, in my mind, the best answer, which is here. But if you want to believe angels got married and they had a lot of giants and they all died in the flood, have at it. That's good. But I think that's what fits best and foremost in that. Talking about the nature of angels, going back to our outline sheet. Angels have superhuman knowledge. In other words, they know more than we know. Why do they know more than we know? Who are they in the presence of? Who are they in the presence of? God. Yeah, they're absolutely in the presence of God, and they're around God and able to hear many of the things which God would have them to do. They are innumerable. That's a hard word to say. They are without number, which is much easier to say. There's a lot of them everywhere around. They're also very interested in man's salvation. Let's go ahead and look up some of these verses. Their interest in man's salvation is seen in the birth of Jesus. Let's look up Luke chapter 2. This is when Jesus is being born, and the announcement of his birth comes.
The angels were in the council of God.
Absolutely. Yes, sir. So they have superhuman knowledge because they're in God's counsel. And God has allowed them to see many things and tells them many things. That's correct. Chapter 2, look at verse 13. Here are the angels, or the shepherds, which are hanging out there, having a good time with their sheep. Suddenly there was an angel with a multitude of heavenly hosts, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace and goodwill to men." Now imagine, maybe you get to be out in the woods sometimes. Maybe you have a hunting camp. Maybe you just live out in the country and you see the beauty of the stars and the sky and see how wonderful everything is. Can you imagine, with folks not used to electricity and not used to movies like we're used to, what it would have been like if suddenly out of nowhere the world lights up and you see innumerable hosts of angels all saying this? That would have rocked my world. Can you imagine how crazy that would have been? As they cry out, "Glory to God in the highest, on earth, peace, goodwill towards men." Because they're probably not saying it slowly, are they? Glory to God in the highest. They're probably very excited when they say it. We see also they're excited when man is converted. Luke 15, looking at verses 4 through 10. "I tell you, in the presence of angels, there is rejoicing in heaven when one sinner repents." That's verse 4, and I think it's also 2 or 3 verses later. When one person repents. In other words, when a person obeys the gospel, there's joy in the presence of the angels. And at the crucifixion of Jesus, as Jesus is struggling in the garden, who is it that comes and tends to him? It's the angels. And also, as we look at Mark 15, this is not listed on our sheet. Who is it standing at the grave saying he is not here? He is risen? It's an angel, absolutely. They're an assembly, not a race of beings. Let's go ahead, look over in Hebrews 12:22. Now, y'all are a lot more country than I am. What am I talking about when I talk about how they're assembly, not a race? Let's go to the classic. How do you get a mule besides buying them at the place? How's a mule created? You get a horse and you get a donkey. Made them together. Now, once you get that mule, can that mule procreate? It cannot, right? Okay, there are some beings which cannot procreate. That's what we're talking about when we talk about angels, okay? 22. It says, "You have come to the Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly host, to innumerable company of angels." And that makes no sense of why I would have written that there. But I bet there was a lot of reason when I was writing all this down. I don't see a verse before or after that talks about that. But what I'm talking about there is you don't have daddy angels, mommy angels, and baby angels. They're not an assembly which procreates. You don't have what goes on here upon the earth. They're spiritual beings. And so you don't have the angels which are marrying, angels which are reproducing and going through that. God created his angels. He created a set number. And that's who it is that exists. And that is it who is there at all times. Now, usually they're in spirit. They're spirit in body. We see that in Psalm 104. But when they need a body, they have a body. Jacob found out very quickly they had a body, didn't he? Remember in Genesis 28, what did he do all night? He wrestled with an angel. And this angel was designed where he could never, ever win. And yet he went all night wrestling with this angel until finally the angel would touch his hip and cause it to be dislocated, and Jacob would limp the rest of his life. So when they need a body, they get a body. But generally they're spirits. And we see in the last half of the book of Daniel that they're spirits as they go along and as they do all this work. Okay? Now, you see your classification of angels there in Colossians 1:16. That's a little deeper than I want to go. So let's skip down. Let's talk about good angels and bad angels. Okay? Now, there's angels, and these are, in air quotes, ordinary angels. I don't know if there's any such thing as an ordinary angel. They're all extraordinary. But these are just your plain, run-of-the-mill angels that you read of in the Bible. They do many different things. I listed the driving of the spirit horses because I don't know exactly what the implication of that is, but you see them doing it a bunch. You see it in 2 Kings when they are around Elisha. And also when you see Elijah, when he is carried up into heaven, what's he carried up in? Fiery chariot, which is going up. Okay? You see, that is the mode of transportation. Now, my question is, and you may have the answer. I don't know if you have the answer or not. Is that the mode of transportation because that was the mode of transportation for people today or of that day? Or is that the mode of transportation because that's the eternal mode? In other words, if we were to see an angel, I don't know if today we'd see him in a chariot or if we'd see him, what's a modern thing? A fiery jet. You know? I don't know if that's what we'd see or not. But you see them oftentimes driving these chariots as they go along. And so Elijah went up in a fiery chariot. Elisha, when he looked up from the mountain, saw all those angels with their fiery chariots, which are there as well. Gathering the elect and separating the good and bad at the time of judgment. Let's go ahead to Matthew 13, 36 through 43. Matthew 13, 36 through 43. About 4 years ago, I was called by the gospel angels. And I thought, well, that'll be fun. You know, I'd read a couple books on angels and written a couple papers on angels. And I thought, that'll be great. And so I was real excited about it. And they said, yeah, it's going to cover a certain aspect of angels. And I was pretty excited because I thought, okay, it'll be angels at the birth of Jesus or angels in the Old Testament or even that age-old question, did angels ever get married? Genesis 6, Matthew 22. No, that wasn't it. The one I got was angels in judgment. What do angels do during the judgment? And to be honest with you, I had never studied that before in my life. I was real aggravated. I thought, well, okay, I'll go to the library, find somebody else, and just copy their stuff. I couldn't find anybody else that ever written about that. And man, it was hard studying out. But once you did it, it's pretty interesting. Look what they do during the day of judgment, 36 through 43. Now, we talked last week about the rich man and Lazarus, right? We talked about the first time which faithful people will see angels is when they're carried up to paradise. Remember Lazarus, when he died, he was carried up by angels into paradise. Probably the first time we'll see him. Now let's go ahead and look in verse 36 of Matthew 13. Then Jesus sent the multitude away and went into the house, and his disciples came to him saying, explain to us the parable of the tares of the field. And he said, okay, he who sows the good seeds, the Son of Man, the field is the world, and the good seeds are the sons of the kingdom, and tares are the sons of the wicked one. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age. The reapers are the angels. Therefore, as the tares are gathered and burned into fire, so it will be at the end of this age. The Son of Man will send out his angels. They will gather out of his kingdom all things that offend and those who practice lawlessness. And they will cast them into the furnace of fire, and there will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous shall shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. All right? So according to that passage, what are angels going to do on the day of judgment? We'll see, and notice this is true in Matthew 25 also, verses 33 through 46. Remember, that's the goats and the goats and the sheep. Or if you're on this side, then would say the goats and the angels. We have the angels will come down and divide those who are righteous and those who are unrighteous. What that will feel like and what that will be like. That separation which is there. That's something which I've thought about a lot, about just how crazy that is in a sense, seeing that separation. And that's something I really hadn't thought about before. Praise and worship, Revelation 5, verse 11. Going back to that, the September issue, the Gospel Advocate, you haven't got that yet, have we? The one that all the Marshall County people are in? Okay. The September issue, the Gospel Advocate. Did anybody in here get the Gospel Advocate? Few people? Okay. All right. One of the interesting things about it is each article in there is from a Marshall County preacher. It focuses on the preachers of Marshall County this month. And it's the first time they've ever done that, focus on a certain area. But it's, I don't know, kind of different. So if you ever get a chance to look at it, check it out. And maybe it'll be good. Maybe it'll be something to look at. All right, let's go back. Let's look on our next page, page 3 if you have it. If you don't have it, it works out just fine anyway. They're also present in worship, looking at general angels, Revelation 5. Now you have two guys, the cherubim and the seraphim. We sing about cherubim and seraphim quite often in our songs, don't we? But we don't really, I think, understand all the times what cherubim are, what seraphim are, what they look like, what they act like, all those sort of things. When we look at cherubs or cherubim, when you go to Kirkland's or some of these home stores, you know what I'm talking about? When you go to Kirkland's, I just go there because I'm a good husband, follow my wife around. What do your cherubs and cherubim look like? Really, huh? Really fat babies, right? I mean, those suckers have rolls of skin, look like the Michelin Man with wings, right? Okay. That's not exactly what they look like in the Bible necessarily. Cherubim are used 24 times singular, 64 times in the plural. Seraphim are only mentioned a few times. They're two separate beings. Cherubim have how many wings? 4 wings, okay? Seraphim have how many wings? 6, okay? So when you get up to heaven, you start checking them out, notice that. You got your 4 wings, you got your 6 wings. That's the difference there. Now look what cherubim do. They're angels who guard the entrance to the paradise. That's back in Galatians chapter 3, verse 24. Remember Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden? The special angel, a cherubim, was set there to guard it, okay? The cherubim gaze upon the mercy seat. They have that obligation there to gaze and look over that seat. You'll see they're placed upon the Ark of the Covenant. They're placed within the tabernacle. They're placed around the areas of the tabernacle. They're guards. Okay? They're woven into the fabric of the tabernacle. They're standing guard over the throne of God when you read in Psalm chapter 80, verse 1, and Psalm chapter 9, verse 1. In other words, cherubim, if we are to transliterate it into our times today, that would be your army. And who keep people from going certain ways. They're the ones who stand at the throne room of God and make sure nobody goes in that shouldn't go in. So it's a lot different in our view of the baby with wings, isn't it? It's a really different view which is there. And so it's interesting because when we talk about cherubim and you look at ancient cultures around that time, you see a lot of different ancient cultures which had something that looked just like cherubim would look. Okay, if you ever look up much Babylon stuff, you've got the lion, which has the wings, which is standing guard in front of the temples. Okay, if you go to Assyria, you have a bull, a mean-looking bull, with wings, which is guarding the entrance of their temple. And probably those would be a better picture of a cherubim than what we have at Kirkland's. Okay, now that's your cherubim, 4 wings. Now we have our seraphim. And let's go to the place where we have the best picture of seraphim, Isaiah chapter 6, and let's look at verses 2 and 6. Isaiah 6, verses 2 and 6. This is Isaiah's call. Starting at verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on the throne, high and lifted up. The train of his robe filled the temple. And above it stood 2 seraphim. One had 6 wings, and with 2 of it he covered his face, 2 he covered his feet, and 2 he flew. And they cried out one to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the post of the door was shaken by him who cried out, and the house is filled with smoke. You remember, Isaiah will say, Woe is me. I am a man of unclean lips. I come from a people of unclean lips. I will die because I've seen the Lord. And of course, the angel comes forth, touches his mouth with a coal and cleanses him. And then the call comes out from the throne. Who shall I send my message? And Isaiah, now that he's cleansed, says, Here am I, send me. All right, that's down to verse 6. All right, we're focusing on the first part of that. Here you have your seraphim. Now, why do they have 6 wings? With 2 of them, they cover their eyes. 2 of them, they cover their feet. And with 2 of them, they fly. Now, why in the world are they doing all those things? If you're in the presence of God, as righteous and as holy as God is, can you gaze upon him? No. Yes. See no evil. You have to cover your eyes, okay? Now, in this culture, in this time, it was immodest. This is the burqa times, I guess you would say. It was immodest for anybody to see your feet or your ankles. And so to show full modesty before God, what did they do with those other 2 wings? They covered their feet. In other words, they're showing modesty. They're showing the power of God. and with two wings they fly back and forth. So there you see that picture of seraphim, which are there as they go back and forth. Now, we see maybe a grander picture and a more interesting picture in the parallel passage in the New Testament. And that is in Revelation chapter 4. We don't really have enough time to go through all of Revelation chapter 4, but you'll see the different beasts, how each one is different, and as you bring those four through, each one represents a portion of the world. Remember in the book of Revelation, you have your numbers, right? You get your numbers of symbolism straight, the rest of the book falls in place. 4 represents the earth, because you got 4 corners of the earth, north, east, south, and west. And that's the reason you have the 4 beasts which are worshiping. All right, then you go, we have enough time. Then you have your other angels. You have your archangels. Let's look in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 16. What's the word arch mean when it's in a prefix like that? If you have an arch enemy, what is he? He's above others. He is one bad dude. Okay, so an archangel would be one good dude. Okay, 1 Thessalonians 4:16. Hopefully this is not another verse which just floats around. Sometimes they'll float around on me. 4:16? Yes. This is talking about the second coming. For the Lord himself would descend from heaven with a shout, and with the voice of the archangel, and the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. That will probably come back up tonight again in our lesson. Okay, you also see the archangel over in Jude 9. So from this, we see that there are some angels that are higher than other angels. Maybe generals of the army, maybe great leaders of some sort. And there has been a lot of writing through the Middle Ages, and there's starting to be a lot of writing again about who these are, what their names are, and it goes on and on and on. Best answer is we don't know. Not all these things are revealed to us. Now we see that Michael is called an archangel, and we'll look at him in a little bit. We also see another angel that has a name Gabriel, but we're never told that he is an archangel specifically. We're just told he's an angel, Gabriel, which will show up. Michael is called an archangel, and he will show up every once in a while. Now, you get into what's called the Apocrypha. You know what the Apocrypha is if you're a regular church member? And if you don't, that's perfectly fine, but New Testament. They're not inspired. A lot of them are mythology, and a lot of them is just typical history that lets us know what happened in those 400 years. In the mythology, which is written during that time, you'll have 6 angels, which will be mentioned in the book of Enoch and also the book of Tobit. That's not inspired. That's just what people thought around the days of Jesus. And so you'll run into some of them. An angel called Raphael. If you belong to the Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormons, they have a lot of other archangels which they bring up. Those aren't rooted in Scripture. We don't know what all these archangels' names would be. We just know on the last day an archangel is going to be shouting as he brings forth the angels and as he accompanies Jesus to come down. We just know the archangel fought with Moses over the body of Moses, and we know that there's an angel named Michael. There's an angel named Gabriel. Let's introduce ourselves to Michael, okay? Michael is known in Revelation 12, 7 through 9. He leads a battle or a war with Satan and his angels. And also he is the one who fought and disputed with Moses over he is disputed with Satan over the body of Moses. That's Jude verse 9. He also came with assistance, helping of another angel in the book of Daniel, Daniel 10, 1 through 14. Now I mentioned last week, a lot of what we know about angels is found in the last half of the book of Daniel. Now, what's wrong with that? We never covered the last half of the book of Daniel because it is complicated and it's kind of hard to go through. What's happening here in chapter 10? Anybody remember? You have the angel of Israel, okay? And the angel of Israel is headed to Israel, and he gets waylaid by another angel. And it's the angel of who? Persia. And the angel of Persia restrains the angel of Israel, and Michael, the archangel, shows up, and Michael knocks over the angel of Persia so the angel of Israel can go and do his work. You ever heard that before? Sure you have, in your daily Bible reading and stuff. But, it's one of those things we don't talk about very often. We see the angels which were fighting for God's people, Daniel 12 and verse 1. And, of course, we just mentioned 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and his co-announcing of God coming. Okay? Everybody's getting glazed over. Are we okay? I feel like I've been preaching for 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, everybody glazes, and they're like, oh, look at the light bulbs, So I don't want to glaze us. So calm down. Shake it out. Shake it out. All right. We also have Gabriel. Gabriel will interpret Daniel's vision, helps interpret many of these dreams which Daniel is having. He's the one who shows up to the father of John the Baptizer, Zacharias, and explains to him, you're going to have a baby, and that baby's name is going to be John. And everybody says John's a horrible name, and he ends up going mute until he's born because of his arguments. And he also participates in the announcement to Mary that Jesus would be born. All right. Now, going through all that, those are our good angels we read about. Generally, you have all your angels, and if angels, if it doesn't say they're bad angels at the beginning, assume they're good. You have, on top of that, Michael and Gabriel. Those are the two we know by name. Gabriel, most likely, most often, is the one who is announcing about Jesus, announcing about the good news which is coming. Michael is the one who seems to be fighting and leading God's people. He seems to be God's general during many of these battles. And then you have the cherubim and seraphim, which appear to be beasts of some sort. The cherubim are always guarding the entrance, and they're guarding, they're kind of like the honor guard of God. And then you have your seraphim who are engaging and leading the worship in Israel. Now, that's not complicated. How confusing could that be? It's one of the reasons we don't cover angels very often, huh? We've got a few minutes. Let's talk about some of these bad angels. Now, why could angels be bad? You ever think about that? Did they? Well, good. All right.
Satan was the angel. He wanted to take over Jesus' place.
Okay. The jealousy which is there. Yeah. Angels are different than we are. And we talked last week for a few minutes about how we have the plan of salvation. God knew we were going to sin. And even before the creation of the world, he planned out your salvation and mine too. And so when I sin, I have an advocate. I have a propitiation. That is Jesus Christ. When I sin, I recognize, hey, I've got hope because Jesus died on the cross for me. Now, Jesus died for man. He didn't die for angels. Angels, when you and I read in the Bible, we don't see an occasion of repentance for them. They're in the presence of God, and they know more than we know. They have superhuman knowledge, and so they don't have to deal with faith like we have to deal with faith. They don't have to deal with hope like we deal with hope. You see that in 1 Corinthians 13:13. So let's talk about some of these bad angels. 2 Peter 2:4, also Jude 6. Both times, there are some angels which are being kept in prison. Okay? In other words, they are being kept in restraint until the time of judgment comes. There's a time coming in which they will be judged, but they are kept in restraint. But we also see some that are free. Now, this is where it gets weird, wild, and wacky. They're free. Bad angels are free. You see, at least symbolically, Michael is warring against these angels in heaven. Revelation 12, verses 7 through 9. You look at the very end of Romans 8, talking about the blessings we receive. We know that nothing can keep us from the love of God, neither height, nor depth, nor breadth. Neither the principalities or powers of darkness can keep us out of heaven, right? In Ephesians 6, for we do not war against flesh and blood, but against what? Principalities, powers and principalities. In other words, there is a spiritual battle which is occurring. Just like Elisha, when his servant, there in 2 Kings, looked across and saw all that army from Assyria coming down to attack him. And he said, hey, we're outnumbered. We're in trouble, Elisha. Why aren't you worried like I'm worried? Elisha prayed that his eyes would be opened, and he saw that army, but he saw an army much greater of fiery chariots. And what Elisha is doing is saying, hey, you need to open your eyes and see this is a spiritual battle. Now, recognize we're in a spiritual battle. A lot of times we feel like, hey, it's just me. And, I'm wrestling against an addiction I have. I'm wrestling against temptations I have. I'm wrestling against the struggles I have. And I'm all alone. And what Paul is saying in Ephesians 6 and what we read in these other passages is this is not just right here. This is a heavenly war being raged. And you have Jesus and God and his angels here, and you have all the angels of the world, the bad angels, and they're fighting, they're conflicting against one another. And they're fighting over you. They're fighting over me. And it's a huge battle which is there. It's like the song sometimes we'll sing, there's a battle which is raging back and forth. Jerry Johnson used to always lead it. Who gets a deciding vote? You do. Well, the Lord's going to decide at the end, doesn't he? But as far as which direction we're going, we make the deciding. God's going to win. But know that God's going to win regardless. God has never, ever, ever been defeated. These bad angels, they oppose God's work. Daniel 10:10-14. They afflict the people of God. They execute Satan's purposes. They hinder the spiritual life of God's people. And they try to deceive God's people as well. Now, there's a study there. I have 1 minute left. In the Old Testament, you see a lot more about the sovereignty of God. What's the word sovereignty mean? Okay. God is in charge of everything. Is there anything God's not in charge of? No. He's in charge of everything. Now, this messes with our mind because we read James and other passages. James says God does not tempt us, and God doesn't tempt us. But does God allow us to face temptation? Sure. Is God in control of that? Sure. God is over all. God allows us to face temptation. Why? Okay. To prove ourselves worthy, to help us find a way out, to help us to grow. Help us to learn in faith, grow in faith, and become better. God allows all these angels, and God allows these things. God allows life because it's where we show faith. By your endurance, according to 2 Corinthians 12, by your endurance with the thorn in the flesh, you show your faith. You show how much you trust God. And God sees you through that battle and sees you through that war. Okay? Any questions? All right. I'm letting you out early. Don't run in the halls. Otherwise, we'll have to keep you after till your parents come pick you up.